Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davids from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm super happy to have on the show today Diego Javier Luis. He is a Zenobia Award finalist and designer of Obraje. How you doing, Diego?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Liz.
Yeah, I'm super happy to meet you and hear about your game. So, for people who have not been following Zenobia, what's the story on Obraje?
So, Obraje is a game set in the 17th century in colonial Mexico. The word means textile mill. And I chose that because the textile mills in Mexico at this time were the most brutal sites of colonial labor and enslavement as well. And the point of the game is to try to achieve as much social mobility as possible um, within this very restrictive environment. And I'm calling it a choices matter role playing historical simulation because the whole purpose of the game is making a series of decisions. So each turn, a player draws a card that presents them with a kind of moral conundrum. And depending on what they choose, there's a coin toss, basically a randomized result of that decision, and that will determine either advancement, stagnation, or going backwards on the kind of multiple scales of social mobility throughout the simulation. And I find this period so fascinating. One, as a historian of the period, but two, because Mexico was at the center of both the Atlantic and the Pacific worlds at this time. So it's a rapidly globalizing society that's going through enormous social changes. And so I just wanted to bring that a lot to life for players.
That's really interesting. So, how did you decide that you were interested in 17th century textile mills?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a historian by trade. so so for me that's kind of an easy one because I just find it fascinating. And I study the colonial period in Latin America. I teach the colonial period in Latin America. Really focused on Mexico again because I'm interested in the populations coming to the Americas across both the Atlantic and the Pacific. It's a society comprised of not only multiple ethno-linguistic groups of indigenous people, but also Western Europeans, of course, West and West Central Africans, and Asians coming from across the Pacific too. And many of these people are meeting and interacting in spaces like the textile mill, and having to think through what it means to inhabit such a space, to live in this kind of very restrictive, constraining, oftentimes violent colonial society, and how to sort of make the most of these circumstances. So kind of that's how I got drawn into the world of the textile mill.
Oh, that's awesome. So, also, I should have introduced you, it sounds like, as Dr. Luis.
Oh, right, yeah. So I do have a PhD in history, but I'm not about all the titles. But
Fair
yeah.
enough, fair enough. But it also seems you could have expressed your interest in this period in a number of different ways because, you are a fully trained historian. I know you must write a lot. I know you must read a lot about this history. What made you feel that a game was the best way to express it to others?
So one, I'm a gamer myself, so I've gotten a lot out of games that force players to make decisions where there's no clear right decision and there's no clear wrong decision. You kind of it's so situationally contingent, but makes you feel like your own sense of morality is being tested as you go through the game. So I'm thinking a lot here about the Telltale games, which I've played a lot of, big fan. I'm also thinking about games that have come out recently, like Frostpunk 2, for example, where you have to balance like um, making decisions that will like piss off one political group but sort of ingratiate you with another. So I'm all about having choices in a game that feel morally significant and fraught for players. And so like the decision to create a game about the textile mills during the colonial period um, is to try to make the kind of vivid or visceral lived reality of a space like that come to life. But yeah, I want players to inhabit the subject position of someone in a textile mill for whom there is no right decision to try to either get out of the mill or to advance their position or to look out for themselves, which may require um, making morally fraught decisions. And that's because there is no right way, there's no wrong way, and there's so many sort of paradoxical moments that you get from reading the colonial archive of these spaces. People make decisions that from the 21st century subject position, it doesn't make sense, right? Why someone would choose to intentionally commit blasphemy, for example, and expose themselves to inquisitorial punishment. Why would someone make such a decision? Why would somebody, when commanded to punish their fellow bondsmen or bondswoman within an obraje, choose to comply with such an order, right? But when you put yourself in that subject position and you think about what you stand to gain or what you stand to lose, then the whole landscape of decision making changes. And I think that that allows for a greater sense of empathy with the historical actors who were actually faced with many of the decisions that are present in Obraje.
Very interesting. So when you were coming up with this game, is this something that you are envisioning playing with students, or is this something that's more for like a personal game night?
So I envision it in both settings. When I've done the play testing, it's been mostly with students and with colleagues. I think that it has a kind of natural fit for a classroom environment, and I'm hoping to also write kind of an article length publication to accompany it that kind of explains the thought process behind why I made many of the kind of design decisions that I made when designing it. But yeah, I would love to see it as a kind of standalone thing that exists beyond the classroom as well, because I think it has a kind of broader applicability. And for people who enjoy choices matter RPGs, then this would be, in a historical setting especially, then this would be an interesting addition to that genre.
So mechanically, how much has the game evolved since beginning the project until now, mere days before you have to submit your final prototype?
Don't remind me, Liz. Yeah, we've got 4 days before the next submission. But so this is a game I've been thinking about kind of off and on for several years now. It started as an idea just tossing around with a few buddies, like thinking through some of the scenarios that a player might encounter and imagining how our students might react to being faced with these scenarios that take you far out of the kind of comforts of a 21st century college classroom, for example. um, but it's gone through a lot of evolution since then, since those early conversations. And one of the major I guess benefits of going through the Zenobia process is sort of being forced to clarify many of many of the mechanics that were hypothetical. But there were a lot of things that I sort of added to make the game more dynamic, more tense. Players can denounce each other to the Inquisition now, for example, which does not always results in a full inquisitorial proceeding, which is historically accurate. For example, a denunciation can also backfire. So there's kind of risk management that's part of every decision a player might make. You can try to get married. You can I say try because again, this does not may not always work out as you think it will work out if you try to pursue these avenues. But also the player begins by choosing a caste category among the caste categories that were present in Mexico during the 17th century. Each category comes with a kind of special ability that players can use throughout the game. They can choose an O or an A ending for their character, meaning a masculine gendered or feminine gendered character, which also comes with a particular kind of risk management as well. So there are a lot of ways that I wanted to make each player's experience unique as they go throughout the game. And so that by the end, whether or not they end up quote unquote winning by reaching the highest stage of social mobility, which of course requires many things that a player might ask themselves. So what did I have to sacrifice to win the game? But whether or not you end up in that highest level, you still have a biography of a person that's actually plausible for someone who lives during the 17th century, and each one will be unique during each playthrough. So that was I'd say the core element of play that I wanted to clarify through the Zenobia process.
That's awesome. So it sounds like the one of the things that would be challenging about this game is it sounds like you're asking players to make very difficult decisions, morally highly questionable decisions from our cozy place here in this century. So how how far were you willing to go with that? And what kinds of positions do you feel comfortable putting your players into?
Yeah. So I'm for this simulation, I want to go quite far with it. I mean, there are of course hard limitations to what that consists of, um, but uh, but I want to represent many of those kinds of paradoxical elements of colonial society that I mentioned before, and I'm really inspired by the historical work that folks like Pablo Sierra, who's written a lot about the Obrajes in colonial Mexico, Javier Villaflores, who wrote about blasphemy, which I mentioned previously, and also the work of Danielle Terrazas Williams, who I often teach with because she talks about a case in colonial Jalapa, which is sort of on the eastern side of Mexico, in which you have a woman who's described as a mulata, meaning that she's described as a mixed Afro-Mexican woman. And she ends up becoming, she's a descendant of enslaved people, and she becomes not only an enslaver herself, but also an enslaver of her family members, her siblings specifically. And so one of the major questions that emerges from this seeming paradox is, how did this end up happening? Why would someone choose to enslave their family members? What are the kind of power dynamics that are at play? How does this speak to the kind of marginal position that women in general faced within colonial society? And so there are so many questions that emerge from that. And I think that that there's a way to represent not that exact situation, but similarly kind of morally fraught situations in ways that don't sort of relegate that to like, oh, I can't possibly imagine how that could be possible, but thinking through like what's actually the kind of moral or economic or political calculus behind these really really complicated social realities.
Ooh, all right. I selfishly just have to know, but I'm going to turn it into like a real question. You mentioned blasphemy and the Inquisition several times. So, how does religion play a role? And then also, I guess that kind of has a follow on of what aspects of society were you not able to fit into this game that you maybe wanted to?
Yeah, those are great questions. So yeah, religion, as you know, religion was important to colonial society. Not only Catholicism, but also the religions that people brought from overseas too, and also indigenous spiritual beliefs that were present there as well. And so I tried to represent all of these in various ways in the simulation. Um, One, because non-Catholic religious practice was an important way to build community within enslaved and free societies, and to kind of resist the strictures of the Catholic Church. So that's present, but also you have many people who were part of the kind of caste system, who were not Spanish, not European, who were practitioners of Catholicism, and for whom Catholicism was kind of a spiritual haven and a way of integrating with colonial society. Um, but where blasphemy comes in is, you have situations where if someone in the Obraje is being punished and they feel that their punishment is unjust, um, there are situations where people would denounce God and the Virgin Mary and the saints, in order to, and this is an interesting part, in order to invoke the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. So basically, by denouncing God, you're inviting inquisitorial inquiry so that you can then protest your unjust treatment before the inquisitors. And this is because an enslaver or slave master was responsible um, for the kind of consistent Catholic instruction of his or her enslaved people. And this was, in fact, not only an obligation of a slave master or enslaver, but actually what legitimized enslavement as an institution within the colonial world, was this obligation. And so if an enslaver was found to have violated that obligation by unjustly punishing their enslaved, it was possible, and it did happen in some cases, where that enslaver would lose ownership over the enslaved person, and the Inquisition would transfer that person to another enslaver. So it was, it was a very risky strategy because the Inquisition might punish the enslaved person even more. But in some cases, it did have this outcome in which an enslaved person could actually achieve being transferred to another enslaver, and potentially um, avoiding those kinds of unjust punishments in the future. So these are the kind of tactics that people with no power, really, in colonial society were still able to exercise. And there are a wide range of these kinds of strategies that are also, to a degree, replicated within the game. So things that I couldn't represent, I mean, there's so much that the actual, I mean, scenarios and possible resolutions to scenarios. I mean, I have pages and pages and pages of writing on this, but yeah, I mean, there are limitations to the kind of mobility that people experienced in the colonial world, because this is really focused on central Mexico. I mean, you have many cases of people going to like Guatemala or to California or down to Peru, across the ocean to Spain or maybe the Philippines, and then back to Mexico. And people were moving all over the place all the time. And kind of limiting myself to central Mexico means that those are sort of out of the frame. Although there are sort of references to people moving around, but as a player, you're kind of confined to Mexico City, Puebla, also in central Mexico, Veracruz on the Atlantic coast, and Acapulco on the Pacific coast. So trying to get that kind of geographic coverage for central Mexico, and each of those spaces kind of have slightly different mechanics, depending on where you are. But I was thinking, maybe in the future there could be an expansion in Peru, where you could actually go somewhere and then have unique scenarios there and then come back to Mexico, for example. But yeah.
Oh, that's super interesting. All right, so I have one more real question, and then we'll go on to softy stuff. So,
Okay.
what how do I ask this? What does victory look like in your game, if there is any victory condition? And then, how do you get there, and what are you incentivizing by setting the victory condition the way that you do in a game like this?
I love that question. That in many ways, that question is at the center of what this is all about, because the game tells you that. So, okay, let me back up and say that there are 4 rings of social mobility. And I like the kind of metaphor of the ring because sometimes it feels like you're just going in circles. And but there are 4 rings. Ring 1 is where you begin. That's in the Obraje. And then ring 4 is, you're kind of member of the lower colonial elite, which is, as high as someone who's very lucky, and maybe plans this way, is able to achieve. So the game tells you that, after a certain number of turns, which represents an entire life, the person who's in the highest ring with the most of the 2 of the game's currencies, which are capital cards representing material wealth and honor cards representing social prestige. If you have the most of those, then you win the simulation. But winning can also be a kind of hollow victory because because you have this whole biography, and you can look back on the decisions that you've made and think about if that's actually winning. If materially winning is the same as morally winning. And I've kind of played with how to represent this in terms of the mechanics of the game, because earlier iterations of the simulation, I think, were a little bit too easy, in that if you simply complied and collaborated, then you had a better chance. But as I thought more about it, and as I kind of iterated and play tested, I wanted collaboration to also be a risky endeavor. And I'm borrowing too from the scholarship of some of my mentors, people like Robert Douglas Cope, who's written that the higher someone who's non-European tried to climb in colonial society, the more kind of restrictions they encountered. And there are the concept of colonial mimicry by Homi Bhabha is also another iteration of that. So I wanted to represent that there were risks to taking the kind of more compliant or collaborative route, and that if you go for a kind of more, and not every card is split between resistance and collaboration, because I also want to explode that binary. But if you take more decisions that are sort of explicitly against the grain of what you're being asked to do or what you're being presented with, that there are also chances to run away, for example. And but it's obviously that's extremely risky as well, and so the player kind of has to constantly weigh what the scenario entails and what are the risks and possibilities to any particular decision. So that's to say that there's no sort of one route to quote unquote victory, and there are many kinds of ideological or political positions that a player can choose to adopt as they're being presented with these scenarios, and they'll just have to find whichever one works best for them.
I like it. All right, so just a couple. This sounds like a really interesting. I really got to play this now. But for now, people who make games usually play them. So what games have you been playing recently that you've enjoyed?
Yeah, so I mentioned the Telltale games previously, and Frostpunk 2, which I recently beat. Big fan of those kinds of games. I'm currently playing Elden Ring, which is very difficult, but I mean, there's a kind of constant theme here, right? Like extremely difficult, like morally fraught games. Like I like games that challenge. and obviously, there's tremendous value to all kinds of sort of emotional experiences that you can have with different kinds of games. But I want players to kind of feel like they've been affected, and that they've actually learned something about themselves and how they themselves would react to being in particular situations. And so I'm kind of drawing inspiration from all these games I'm playing now.
Fantastic. And then, do you maintain an online presence? And if so, where can you be found?
So I'm not super active on social media, but I can say that my work is available online. And I had a book come out this year. It's called The First Asians in the Americas, and it does focus on the relationship between colonial Mexico and the Philippines across the Pacific and the movement of people. And the Obrajes do show up in that work. I also have my own podcast coming out at the end of the month, which is kind of about the personal story behind the writing of the book and why historians make, again, decision making, why historians make the decisions they do when they approach particular histories, because historians are not objective. Um, there's no one way to write history. So the podcast is called the Historian's Table, and it'll be exploring all those kinds of questions.
Fantastic. All right. So we got to draw this to a close, but Diego, thank you so much for coming on talking about this. This sounds really exciting. Congratulations for being a Zenobia finalist, but also like no matter what happens, I really, really need to see this game.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, everybody out there, I can be found everywhere as Beyond Solitaire. Please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.